Regarded as the conscience of the World Bank, Dr. Goodland served the bank as a senior environmental advisor for 23 years. Currently, he is a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute, a nonprofit global think tank that conducts environmental research and provides solutions to governments, companies, and communities regarding ecology-related issues. He has authored or co-authored numerous books on sustainable economic development and the environment, serves as Metropolitan Chair of the Ecological Society of America, and is the past president of the International Association for Impact Assessment. In 2008, he received the first International Union for Conservation of Nature's Coolidge Medal for his outstanding contributions to environmental conservation.
Most people don't know the huge scale of global livestock. The population of land-based animals has grown sixfold since 1960. So this climbing up the food chain is a fairly recent phenomenon in the world. In 2009, 60 billion livestock animals were raised. 60 billion were killed, and 60 billion were eaten by us. Now, a full 1/4 of all land worldwide is used for livestock grazing. 1/3 of all farmable land is now used for growing livestock feed, like soybeans. The Amazon rainforest has been destroyed for cattle ranching and feed production.
Most cattle come from the Amazon forest. People cut down the Amazon forest. The effect of that is it reduces the greenhouse gas sequestration capacity of the forest. Second, they burn the forest, which emits a huge amount of greenhouse gas. Then they raise cattle. Their belches and respiration increases greenhouse gas. And then in the life cycle of livestock, refrigeration, transport, and things like that also emits much more greenhouse gas. In addition, much Amazon forest is cut down not for livestock ranches, but for livestock feed. And this livestock feed, a lot comes into Korea, a lot goes to feed Chinese pigs. And so that's a huge amount of extra greenhouse gas from the livestock process.
The world's forests store approximately 289 gigatons of carbon dioxide in trees and vegetation. Dr. Goodland estimates that at least 200 tons of carbon are released into the atmosphere for each hectare of forest cleared or burned, whereas moderately degraded grassland can store just 8 tons per hectare.
Cutting the Amazon rainforest has huge implications for climate change. The Amazon forest in general is the biggest carbon sink the world has ever known, terrestrial sink. I think the oceans are slightly bigger. But if you cut down the forest, you reduce the capacity of that carbon sink to sequester carbon. Not only do you reduce the carbon absorption of the forest, but when the forest is burnt, having been cut to create cattle pasture, that releases enormous amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The biggest answer that most people think will help prevent climate catastrophe is a massive switch from fossil fuel, that's coal, gas, oil, from fossil fuel over to renewable energy, wind, solar, tidal, geothermal, some small hydro maybe. But that's transition from fossil fuel to renewables. It's essential, but it's too slow. Whatever you do, it's going to take at least 20 years from 2010 to 2030. And most scientists say you cannot wait until 2030. The other thing about the transition from fossil fuel to renewables, it's immensely expensive. The transport sector, all of the cars on the road only emit 6 billion tons. So I know there's a lot of attention devoted to more fuel-efficient cars or getting plug-in hybrid cars, and that's good and it should be accelerated, but frankly it doesn't help much as reducing your own intake of livestock products.
About half the world's grain harvest is diverted to feeding livestock. Another portion is consumed in producing biofuels. In the US, 37% of annual corn production goes to creating corn ethanol. With 1 billion people starving or malnourished in our world, food crops should be reserved for human consumption rather than livestock or energy production.
A prompt repeal of all subsidies for agrofuels from oilseeds and grain. Human food cannot be allowed to compete with vehicle fuels. There just isn't enough food to go around to permit that. We have to halt deforestation and forest fires. Those have to be reversed on a very large scale, particularly tropical forests, particularly the Amazon forest, and switch deforestation over to regeneration, expand the capacity of forest to sequester greenhouse gases. The change of diet would reduce deforestation and forest burning for cattle ranches, particularly in the Amazon basin, where a lot of Chinese pig food and chicken food comes from. And allowing regeneration of the forest would absorb much more greenhouse gas very fast. I think that regeneration of forests is the only way to create large-scale capacity to sequester today's atmospheric carbon. If you replace animal products with alternatives, the world will more easily feed the 9 to 10 billion people expected by 2050. If global hunger and starvation is a big motivation for you, then one of the best ways to do it is to get people to switch and reduce their livestock production.
Mr. Brown holds a master's degree in agricultural economics from the University of Maryland, USA, and in public administration from Harvard University, USA. For over 40 years, he has dedicated himself to work in environmental conservation and economic sustainability. Regarded as the father of modern grassroots environmentalism, the Washington Post says he is one of the most influential thinkers in the world, and the Telegraph of Calcutta calls him the guru of the environmental movement. He has also received numerous honorary degrees and prizes, such as the MacArthur Fellowship, the United Nations Environment Prize, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature Gold Medal.
When I think about national security today, I think we need a new definition, a definition for the 21st century. When I sit with a pad of paper and ask myself, what are the threats today? Number one, climate change. Number two, population growth. Number three, spreading water shortages. Number four, rising food prices. Number five, a growing number of failing states. These are the threats to our security today. Our forests are shrinking, our soils are eroding, our aquifers are being depleted, grasslands are turning into desert. These are very clear trends now. And what we know from studying earlier civilizations who were destroying their environmental support systems is that no civilization can do that indefinitely without eventually declining and collapsing. That's what happened to the Sumerians. It's what's happened to the Mayans. The Mayans, it was deforestation and soil erosion and shrinking food supply, and eventually the civilization disappeared. The Sumerians, it was salt levels building in the soil. As the salt levels went up, yields went down, and then the civilization itself went down. So we're doing all the wrong things environmentally, whether it's climate change or falling water tables, deforestation, soil erosion. All these things are going to undermine civilization unless we can reverse them.
UK Foreign Secretary William Hague states that crop production depends heavily on a steady-state climate. You cannot have food, water, or energy security without climate security. They are interconnected and inseparable. They form four resource pillars on which global security, prosperity, and equity stand. Russia's heat wave of 2010, which was induced by global warming, is one of the most devastating natural disasters in recent memory and had a very large impact on the international food market, since Russia, the world's third largest grain exporter, prohibited exports during the crisis to ensure sufficient food for its citizens.
If at the beginning of last year someone had said to me that the average temperature in Moscow in July will be 14 degrees Fahrenheit, 8 degrees Celsius, above the norm, I would have said, I'm not a climate denier, but that's beyond reason. But it happened. And now that we've seen such a dramatic rise in temperature in one place in the world for a sustained period for a month, we now know it can happen somewhere else. We saw night after night, week after week, smoke-filled streets in Moscow because things were burning throughout Western Russia. Russia was literally burning out of control in a heat wave that started in late June, lasted through July, and went into August. In the end, it did an estimated $300 billion worth of damage. By comparison, Hurricane Katrina in the United States in 2005 did about $100 billion worth of damage. The heat wave in Russia claimed 56,000 lives, a combination of heat, stress, and breathing smoke-filled air, which exacerbated respiratory illnesses. And the grain harvest dropped from 100 million tons, which is what they were hoping for, to 60 million tons. They lost 40% of their grain harvest. If that heat wave had been centered in Chicago, and if the United States had lost 40% of its grain harvest, that's 40% of 400 million tons, the United States and the world would have lost 160 million tons of grain. If that had happened, there would have been chaos in world grain markets by late summer and early fall of last year. Grain prices would have gone to levels we've never seen before. Food prices would be rising throughout the world. Exporting countries would be restricting exports to try to keep their food prices under control.
Mr. Brown notes that the overt signs of imminent civilization collapse are large-scale food shortages, growing numbers of environmental refugees in failing states. The food crisis that occurred between early 2007 and 2008, when the world's wheat, rice, soybean, and corn prices jumped dramatically, is being repeated in 2011. Robert Zoellick, president of the World Bank, thus cautioned in April 2011 that the world is just one shock away from a full-blown food price crisis.
If I were asked to identify 3 indicators that will tell us more about our future and where civilization is headed, the first would be an economic indicator. It would be grain prices. And world grain prices today are double what they were 5 years ago. And they're probably going to go higher in the next few years. How much higher, we don't know. The World Food Price Index set an all-time high, and it's still very close to that. It has not subsided. This was to be a year in which we rebuilt world grain stocks after they were depleted as a result of the heat wave in Russia last year. The price at harvest time, at planting time, was very good. It encouraged farmers. They planted more grain, they used more fertilizer, but they were not able to expand production fast enough to keep up with the growth in demand. So this year, once again, we're going to see a reduction in world grain stocks. The earliest relief we can hope for now is next year, next fall's grain harvest. So we're literally living on the edge right now. And the difficulties in restoring stable food prices and food security for the world are substantial. It used to be that the only source of additional demand for grain was basically population growth. And then some decades ago, people started moving up the food chain, consuming more grain-intensive livestock products. And the third thing is that we're now converting grain into fuel for cars. We've set up a competition between automobile owners and people for the grain supply. In the United States last year, we harvested 400 million tons of grain. Of that, 124 million tons went to ethanol distilleries to produce fuel for cars.
Approximately 70% of available global fresh water is being used for agriculture, and overpumping of water for irrigation is significantly draining the world's groundwater reserves. Saudi Arabia announced in 2007 it was giving up wheat production due to total depletion of its fossil aquifer. Deprived of the 3 million tons of wheat it once produced annually, the country now has to import grain from abroad. Animal agriculture consumes huge volumes of water, and it has been demonstrated by numerous studies that producing animal products is enormously inefficient as it puts a large, unsustainable burden on our natural resources like water. For example, the Twente Water Center in the Netherlands estimates it takes up to 6 times more water to grow a kilogram of animal protein as plant protein, and that producing beef consumes 20 times more water per calorie than grain or potatoes.
We have spreading shortages of irrigation water. Half the world's people live in countries where water tables are falling as a result of overpumping for irrigation. These countries, 18 in total, include China and India. The World Bank estimates that 175 million people in India are being fed with grain produced by overpumping, by depleting their aquifers, which by definition is a short-term phenomenon. I estimate that in China, 130 million people are being fed with grain produced by overpumping. So the water issue, though it's mostly underground and out of sight, is becoming a serious stress on the world food economy and making it more difficult to expand production as fast as we would like.
Global adoption of a plant-based diet can halt 80% of global warming, end world hunger, and free up the Earth's fresh water, as well as many other precious natural resources. It offers a sustainable and secure lifeline for our planet and humanity. In short, it will quickly solve the most serious environmental issues facing the world today. Lester Brown has formulated what he calls Plan B to save our planet and civilization. It is called Plan B because Plan A is simply, as Mr. Brown puts it, business as usual, or no change as to how we treat the Earth. Let's now hear about some of the components of Plan B.
Business as usual is no longer a viable option over the longer term. The question is, what do we do about this? That's why we developed Plan B. 1, cut carbon emissions. 80%, not by 2050, which is what politicians like to talk about, but by 2020. We didn't ask the question, what will be politically feasible or politically acceptable? We asked instead the question, starting with the science, how fast do we have to cut carbon emissions if we want to save the Greenland ice sheet? And I use the Greenland ice sheet because it's sort of a metaphor for the Earth itself. Scientists have told us that if the Greenland ice sheet melts entirely, sea level rises 7 meters. But even a 1 meter rise in sea level would put half of the rice land in Bangladesh underwater. It would put a large piece of the Mekong Delta underwater, and Vietnam is the world's second largest rice exporter. There are 19 other rice-growing river deltas in Asia where rice production would shrink with just a 1 meter rise in sea level. Think of it. Ice melting on an island in the far North Atlantic can shrink the rice harvest in Asia where half the world's people live. We're living in a very complex world. We have to eradicate poverty and then restore the economy's natural support systems. The world now needs to do a great job of reforestation. Each year, the world's forests are shrinking. We have less tree cover than the year before, and we can't continue that indefinitely. The world's soils are eroding, including the soils on our cropland. We see today the formation of huge dust storms in northern and western China and western Mongolia early each spring. So we're losing topsoil big time.
Compared to a vegan diet, a meat diet uses up to 17 times as much land, 14 times as much water, and 10 times as much energy. And if all the grains currently used to feed livestock globally were instead reserved for humans, the entire hungry and malnourished population of the Earth could be fed. Supreme Master Ching Hai often speaks about the importance of the organic vegan diet in eliminating shorter-lived greenhouse gases such as methane from the air, as in this June 2011 video conference hosted by the Supreme Master Ching Hai International Association in Mexico City, Mexico, titled "From Crisis to Peace, the Whole Universe is Blessing Us."
The founder of the Earth Policy Institute, Lester Brown, who is a respected U.S. environmental leader, stated that climate change is happening so fast right now that we need to reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, 80% by 2020 to protect global food supplies even. Just food supplies even. Not 80% by 2050 as suggested before, which is the date discussed by many politicians, but 80% now, soon, by 2020, maximum. Because if we lose food security, our civilization could collapse. Moral standard even could collapse. People's health could deteriorate. Happiness could also collapse. Nation could collapse. Every other things might also collapse. Lester Brown and others point out that the great Mayan civilization in Mexico may have fallen when it lost control over its food supply. Climatologists say that we are facing the same danger now, today. If it happened before, it could happen again. So, how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2020? How do we do that? How do we keep the global temperature at safe levels? There is a solution. A few months ago, the United Nations proposed that the best way to bring about cooling, rather than focusing on carbon dioxide, would be to reduce the shorter-lived global warming agents. These include methane, black carbon, and ground-level ozone. And how? Again, the fastest, cheapest way to do this is to stop raising animals for human consumption.